October 13, 1979. Troop 247 set up camp at Pine Ridge National Forest for their annual survival weekend. 7 boys ages 12 to 14, all excited to earn their wilderness badges. But something was wrong with that forest. The trees were too quiet. The animals had all gone silent. And their Scoutmaster, Mr. Morrison, kept checking his watch like he was waiting for something. By sunrise the boys were gone. Their parents found the camp exactly as they left it, except for 7 small holes in the ground where their merit badges should have been buried. Last week, a hiker found those badges 200 miles away, in a cave that park rangers swear was never there before. Welcome to Lost Mystery Stories. Before we dive into this chilling mystery of vanished scouts, hidden caves, and a truth that's been buried for nearly half a century, tell me in the comments, have you ever been on a camping trip that gave you chills? And if you believe these forgotten stories deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button because we're just getting started. The first leaves of autumn were just beginning to turn when Robert Morrison called the monthly meeting of Boy Scout Troop 247 to order. The basement of Millbrook Community Center smelled of old coffee and mildew, but for the 7 boys seated in folding chairs around Morrison's makeshift desk, it might as well have been mission control for the greatest adventure of their young lives. Morrison stood at the front of the room, a man of average height with prematurely graying hair and eyes that seemed to hold secrets. At 34, he'd been leading the troop for 3 years, ever since the previous Scoutmaster, Bill Henderson, had moved to California. The parents trusted Morrison implicitly. He was organized, safety-conscious, and had an almost encyclopedic knowledge of wilderness survival. What they didn't know was that Morrison hadn't slept properly in weeks, plagued by dreams of a place that called to him from deep within the Pine Ridge National Forest. "Gentlemen," Morrison began, his voice carrying the authority that came with years of military service before his civilian career as manager of Henderson's Sporting Goods, "in 4 weeks, we'll embark on our annual wilderness survival weekend. This year's destination is Pine Ridge National Forest, specifically Campsite 47. Tommy Chen, 12 years old with thick-rimmed glasses and an eager smile, raised his hand. "Mr. Morrison, will we really earn our wilderness survival merit badges on this trip?" Morrison's eyes seemed to linger on Tommy a moment longer than necessary. "That's the plan, Tommy. But earning these badges isn't just about tying knots or starting fires. It's about understanding your place in the natural world, about learning lessons that can't be taught in a classroom or even around a regular campfire." Marcus Williams, 14 and the natural leader among the boys, leaned forward in his chair. "What kind of lessons?" "The kind that change you forever," Morrison replied, and for a moment, his voice carried an odd resonance, as if he were speaking from some great distance. Then he smiled and the moment passed. "But let's not get ahead of ourselves. First, we need to prepare." The 7 boys who would make this journey were a diverse group, united by their shared love of adventure and their trust in their Scoutmaster. Tommy Chen was the intellectual of the group, small for his age but possessing a curiosity that often led him to ask questions adults found uncomfortable. His parents, Margaret and David Chen, had immigrated from Taiwan when Tommy was 3, and they saw scouting as a way for their son to integrate into American culture while learning valuable life skills. Marcus Williams, son of an auto mechanic and a nurse, was the unofficial leader among the boys. At 14 he was the oldest and most experienced camper, having been in scouting since he was 6. His younger brother had wanted to join the trip, but Morrison had been very specific. Only 7 boys would be going. Kevin Hartley, 13, was quiet and observant, the kind of boy who noticed things others missed. His father worked night shifts at the steel mill, so Kevin had learned to be self-reliant from an early age. He had an unsettling habit of staring off into the distance as if he could see things that weren't there. Danny Rodriguez, 12, was the youngest but possessed a fierce determination to prove himself worthy of running with the older boys. His mother worked 2 jobs to support Danny and his 3 sisters, and scouting was one of the few activities she could afford. Danny had been saving his allowance for months to buy proper camping gear. Jake Morrison was the Scoutmaster's own son, 13 years old and bearing the weight of his father's expectations. Other boys sometimes whispered that Jake got special treatment, but the truth was more complicated. Morrison was harder on his son than on any other boy in the troop, as if preparing Jake for some test the others would never face. Billy Foster, 14, came from the wealthiest family in the troop. His father owned a construction company, and Billy had access to the best camping equipment money could buy. What he lacked in financial concerns, he made up for in a strange melancholy that seemed to settle over him during quiet moments, as if he sensed that his comfortable life was somehow temporary. Alex Kumar, 12, was the newest member of the troop, having moved to Millbrook just 6 months earlier when his father took a job at the local hospital. Alex was eager to fit in and often volunteered for the most challenging tasks, trying to prove himself worthy of acceptance by the established group. Over the next 4 weeks, Morrison put the boys through intensive preparation. They practiced knot tying until their fingers were raw. They learned to identify edible plants and dangerous wildlife. They studied topographical maps and compass navigation. But there were other lessons too, stranger ones that the boys didn't quite understand at the time. Morrison taught them about forest silence, how to move through the woods without disturbing the natural order. He showed them breathing techniques that he claimed would help them communicate with wildlife. Most unsettling of all, he taught them a series of hand signals that he said were old Scout traditions, though when Tommy looked them up in his father's collection of scouting handbooks, he found no mention of them. 3 days before departure, Morrison called a special meeting for parents and scouts. The community center was packed with families, the air thick with excitement and the underlying anxiety that comes with sending children into the wilderness. Morrison stood before a large map of Pine Ridge National Forest, using a wooden pointer to trace their planned route. "We'll be staying at campsite 47 here," he said, tapping a spot deep in the forest. "It's about 3 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by this trail. The site has a natural spring for water and is surrounded by excellent examples of the plant and animal life the boys have been studying." Margaret Chen raised her hand. "How often will you check in with rangers?" "The campsite is outside normal radio range," Morrison replied smoothly. "But I've been to this location many times over the years. It's perfectly safe, and the isolation will give the boys the authentic wilderness experience they need for their merit badges." This was a lie, though none of the parents knew it. Morrison had never been to campsite 47. In fact, he'd chosen it specifically because of its isolation, its distance from any help. But more than that, he'd chosen it because of the dreams. For 3 months, Morrison had been experiencing vivid nightmares about Pine Ridge Forest. In these dreams, he walked through woods that were too quiet, too still, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. He followed a path that didn't appear on any map, descending deeper and deeper until he reached a place that existed in the space between sleeping and waking, a place that whispered promises of knowledge that few humans were meant to possess. At first, he dismissed the dreams as stress from his divorce proceedings. His wife had left him 6 months earlier, taking their daughter but leaving Jake behind. The custody battle was ugly and expensive, and Morrison found himself questioning everything about his life, his choices, his purpose. But the dreams persisted, growing more vivid and detailed each night. He began to see the faces of the 7 boys in his troop, not as they were but as they could become, purified by isolation, freed from the corrupting influences of modern society, transformed into something more than merely human. Morrison had begun researching the history of Pine Ridge National Forest, digging through old newspaper archives and geological surveys. What he found disturbed and fascinated him in equal measure. The area that was now the forest had been the site of numerous unexplained disappearances dating back to the 1800s. Entire wagon trains had vanished while crossing the region. Indigenous peoples had considered it cursed ground, a place where the boundary between worlds grew thin. Most intriguing of all was a report from 1847 about a group of pioneers who had emerged from the forest after being missing for 3 weeks. They claimed to have no memory of their time in the woods, but witnesses noted that they seemed fundamentally changed. They spoke in whispers, avoided eye contact, and several were observed having conversations with people who weren't there. Within a year, all members of the group had either died under mysterious circumstances or simply vanished again. The night before the camping trip, Morrison sat in his study surrounded by maps, newspaper clippings, and photographs. On his desk lay 7 brand-new wilderness survival merit badges, each one carefully inscribed with a boy's name and the date October 13, 1979. But these weren't the badges he would present to the boys if they successfully completed their requirements. These were something else entirely, tokens of a transaction that Morrison himself didn't fully understand. He picked up one of the badges, Tommy Chen's, and felt it pulse with warmth in his palm. As he watched, the embroidered design seemed to shift and writhe, revealing symbols that hurt to look at directly. Morrison closed his eyes and saw Tommy as he would become, his bright curiosity transformed into something darker and more profound, his questions answered in ways that would break his young mind. Morrison opened his eyes and set the badge aside. Tomorrow he would take 7 innocent boys into the woods. What would emerge, if anything, would no longer be entirely human. The parking lot of Millbrook Elementary was buzzing with activity as parents helped their sons load backpacks, sleeping bags and camping gear into Morrison's Ford van. The October air was crisp with the promise of winter, and the trees surrounding the school were ablaze with autumn colors. Morrison moved through the organized chaos with military precision, checking equipment against his list, ensuring that each boy had the required items. But he paid special attention to weight limits, insisting that the boys could bring only the absolute essentials. "Remember," he told Billy Foster, who was trying to pack a portable radio, "this is about learning to survive with what nature provides. Excess gear is just a crutch that prevents real growth." Billy reluctantly removed the radio from his pack, along with several other comfort items his mother had suggested. The other parents noticed Morrison's strictness but attributed it to his thorough approach to outdoor education. Margaret Chen hugged Tommy tightly, whispering instructions in his ear about staying close to the group and following all of Mr. Morrison's rules. David Chen shook Morrison's hand firmly. "Take care of our boy," David said in his careful English. "He is more precious to us than all the merit badges in the world." Morrison met David's eyes with unsettling intensity. "I understand exactly how precious he is," he replied. "He'll receive the kind of attention that will change his life forever." The other parents made similar farewells. Marcus Williams's mother packed extra snacks, just in case, despite Morrison's instructions about minimal provisions. Kevin Hartley's father, exhausted from his night shift at the mill, managed a sleepy wave as his son climbed into the van. Danny Rodriguez's mother crossed herself and whispered a prayer in Spanish, a gesture that made Morrison's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Jake Morrison sat in the front passenger seat, trying to project confidence despite the knot of anxiety in his stomach. Over the past few weeks, his father had been different. More intense, more focused, but also somehow more distant, as if a part of him had already left for places Jake couldn't follow. "Dad," Jake said quietly as Morrison started the engine, "are you sure about this campsite? I looked it up on the maps and it seems really isolated." Morrison's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Isolation is exactly what we need, son. The modern world has too many distractions, too many easy answers. If these boys are going to learn what they truly need to know, we have to take them somewhere the noise can't follow." As the van pulled away from the school, several parents waved goodbye. None of them noticed Morrison checking his rearview mirror not to wave back, but to ensure they weren't being followed. None of them saw him take a different route than the one he'd shown them on the map. And none of them knew that the campsite he'd claimed to know so well didn't actually exist in any official Forest Service records. The drive to Pine Ridge National Forest should have taken 2 hours. Morrison stretched it to 4, taking back roads and scenic routes that led steadily away from civilization. The boys chatted excitedly at first, pointing out interesting sights and speculating about the weekend ahead. But as the roads grew narrower and the forest thicker, a strange quiet settled over the group. Tommy Chen, always the most observant, was the first to notice something odd. "Mr. Morrison," he said, looking up from the map spread across his lap, "I think we missed the turn for the main park entrance." Morrison glanced in the rearview mirror, meeting Tommy's concerned gaze. "We're taking a different route, Tommy. A back way that most visitors don't know about. It'll give us a more authentic wilderness experience." But Tommy's frown deepened as he studied the map. According to his calculations, they were heading in the wrong direction entirely, deeper into the forest-restricted areas where camping wasn't permitted. He started to voice this concern when Marcus Williams placed a hand on his arm. "Trust Mr. Morrison," Marcus said quietly. "He knows what he's doing." What none of the boys could have known was that Morrison was following a route he'd never traveled before, guided by something that wasn't quite memory and wasn't quite instinct. The dreams that had plagued him for months were becoming clearer as they drove deeper into the forest, as if proximity to their destination was strengthening some invisible signal. As afternoon faded toward evening, the van turned onto an unmarked dirt road that seemed to wind endlessly through stands of pine and oak. The road was barely wide enough for the vehicle, and branches scraped against the windows with sounds like fingernails on glass. "How much farther?" asked Alex Kumar, who was beginning to feel carsick from the winding road. "We're almost there," Morrison replied, but his voice carried a strange quality as if he were speaking in his sleep. The sun was setting when they finally stopped. Morrison parked the van in a small clearing beside what appeared to be a trailhead, though there was no sign marking it and no indication that Forest Service personnel had ever maintained this area. The trees here were different from those they'd passed earlier. Older, taller, their branches interweaving overhead to form a canopy so thick that very little daylight penetrated to the forest floor. "Everybody out," Morrison announced with forced cheerfulness. "Time to shoulder those packs and earn our keep." As the boys climbed out of the van and began gathering their gear, several of them noticed things that would trouble their sleep in the nights to come, if they were granted nights to come. The forest was absolutely silent. No bird songs, no insect buzzing, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. The air smelled wrong, not like pine and earth, but like something ancient and metallic, like coins that had been buried for centuries. Most unsettling of all was the way their own voices seemed to be absorbed by the trees, as if the forest were swallowing every sound they made. Danny Rodriguez tried to whistle while adjusting his pack, but the melody died just inches from his lips. "Mr. Morrison," Kevin Hartley said, looking around with the sharp awareness that came from years of early morning solitude, "this doesn't feel like a regular campground." Morrison was consulting a hand-drawn map that none of the boys recognized, holding it close to his chest so they couldn't see the details. "That's because it's not regular, Kevin. This is a place set aside for special purposes, for boys who are ready to learn special lessons." Billy Foster, despite his family's wealth and the confidence it usually provided, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. "What kind of special lessons?" Morrison folded his map and looked at each boy in turn, his gaze lingering on their faces as if memorizing them. "The kind that can't be unlearned," he said simply. "Now let's get moving. We have about a mile hike to reach our campsite, and I want to get there before full dark." The path they followed couldn't accurately be called a trail. It was more like a suggestion in the forest floor, a subtle parting of undergrowth that might have been made by deer or might have been carved by something else entirely. Morrison led with the confidence of someone who had walked this route many times, though several of the boys noticed that he seemed to be navigating by instinct rather than by any visible landmarks. The forest grew denser as they hiked, the trees pressing closer together until they formed walls on either side of the narrow path. The canopy overhead thickened until only scattered patches of dying sunlight managed to penetrate, creating a twilight world even though sunset was still an hour away. Tommy Chen, hiking near the back of the group, began to fall behind. His pack, while meeting Morrison's weight requirements, felt impossibly heavy, as if it were filled with stones rather than camping gear. More troubling was the sensation that someone was walking beside him, just out of his peripheral vision. Every time he turned to look, there was nothing there, but the feeling persisted. "Marcus," Tommy called softly to the older boy ahead of him, "do you feel like we're being followed?" Marcus paused and looked back down the trail. It curved away behind them, disappearing into the gloom between the trees. "I don't see anything," he said, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there earlier. Jake Morrison, hiking directly behind his father, began to notice something strange about the path itself. In several places, it seemed to fork or branch off in directions that didn't match the terrain. When he looked directly at these alternate routes, they appeared to be normal forest floor, but when he looked away and back again, the paths seemed to flicker in and out of existence. "Dad," Jake said quietly, not wanting to alarm the other boys, "are you sure we're going the right way? Some of these trail markers don't look official." Morrison stopped abruptly, causing the entire line of boys to bunch up behind him. He turned to face his son, and in the fading light, Jake could have sworn his father's eyes reflected the dying sunlight like an animal's. "There are no trail markers where we're going, Jake," Morrison said. "We're beyond the jurisdiction of the Forest Service now. We're in older territory governed by older rules." The boys exchanged worried glances, but none of them was willing to challenge Morrison directly. He was their leader, their guide, and they were miles from civilization. They had no choice but to trust him. As full darkness began to fall, Morrison suddenly stopped and pointed ahead. "There," he said with satisfaction. "Our home for the weekend." The boys peered through the gloom and saw a clearing ahead, roughly circular and surrounded by towering pines that seemed to lean inward like spectators at an arena. But this wasn't the developed campsite they'd been expecting. There was no fire pit, no picnic table, no evidence that humans had ever used this place for recreation. "Mr. Morrison," Danny Rodriguez said hesitantly, "are you sure this is the right spot? It doesn't look like campsite 47. Morrison was already moving into the clearing, his movements more confident now, as if he were finally on familiar ground. "This is exactly where we're supposed to be," he said. "Sometimes the most important destinations aren't on any official map." As the boys reluctantly followed him into the clearing, several of them noticed that their footsteps seemed to echo strangely, as if they were walking on hollow ground. The grass beneath their feet was oddly uniform in height and color, more like a carefully maintained lawn than natural forest floor. But the most unsettling discovery was yet to come. As Morrison directed the boys to set up their tents in a specific formation around the center of the clearing, Chen made an observation that would haunt him through the long night ahead. The clearing was perfectly circular, and the trees surrounding it were all exactly the same height and species, despite the varied forest they'd walked through to get here. It was as if this space had been artificially created, carved out of the wilderness by something that understood geometry better than nature. "Mr. Morrison," Tommy said, trying to keep his voice steady, "how long has this clearing been here?" Morrison was busy setting up his own tent, positioned at what seemed to be the focal point of the circle. "Longer than you might think, Tommy. Much longer. This place has been waiting for the right group of boys, the right circumstances, the right moment in time." As the boys worked to set up their camp in the gathering darkness, none of them noticed Morrison consulting his hand-drawn map one final time before folding it carefully and placing it in his jacket pocket. None of them saw him check his watch, 9:47 p.m., and nod with satisfaction. And none of them observed him walking to the exact center of the clearing, kneeling down, and placing his palm flat against the earth while whispering words in a language that predated English by thousands of years. But they all felt the response, a subtle vibration in the ground beneath their feet, as if something vast and ancient had just awakened from a long sleep. By 10 o'clock, 7 small tents stood in a perfect circle around the clearing, each positioned according to Morrison's specific instructions. The boys had been told that this formation would provide optimal wind protection and drainage, but the real reason had nothing to do with camping comfort and everything to do with the geometric requirements of what was about to unfold. Morrison had insisted that they forego a campfire that first night, claiming that they needed to practice dark adaptation as part of their wilderness survival training. The boys were disappointed. The campfire was traditionally the heart of any scouting trip, the place where stories were told and bonds were forged, but they complied with their Scoutmaster's wishes. As a result, the clearing was illuminated only by the pale light of a quarter moon filtering through the canopy above. The effect was disorienting. Familiar camping gear took on strange shapes in the dim light, and the sounds of the night seemed muffled and distorted. Chen lay in his sleeping bag, staring up at the roof of his tent and listening to the silence. In his 3 years of scouting, he'd never experienced a campsite so completely devoid of natural sounds. There were no owls calling, no insects chirping, no rustling of nocturnal animals in the underbrush. It was as if they had entered a zone where normal life couldn't survive. But the silence wasn't complete. As Tommy strained his ears, he began to detect other sounds, subtle rhythmic noises that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. There was a low humming, almost below the threshold of hearing, that pulsed in time with his heartbeat. And beneath that, something that might have been whispers or might have been the wind moving through underground passages. In the tent next to Tommy's, Marcus Williams was having similar experiences. As the unofficial leader of the boys, Marcus felt responsible for their safety, and his instincts were telling him that something was very wrong with their situation. The campsite felt staged, artificial, like a movie set designed to look like wilderness but lacking the authentic chaos of nature. Marcus unzipped his tent flap just enough to peer out into the clearing. Morrison's tent was visible across the circle, but there was no light inside it, no indication that their Scoutmaster was awake. Yet Marcus had the distinct feeling that they were being watched, that eyes he couldn't see were studying them from the darkness beyond the tree line. A soft sound from the direction of Morrison's tent caught Marcus's attention. It was barely audible, like someone speaking in an extremely low voice or reading aloud from a book. Marcus listened intently, trying to make out words, but the sounds were too indistinct to understand. What was clear was that Morrison was awake and apparently conducting some kind of activity that hadn't been part of their planned itinerary. Kevin Hartley, in his tent on the far side of the circle, was experiencing something even more disturbing. As someone who'd spent countless nights alone due to his father's work schedule, Kevin was comfortable with darkness and solitude. But this darkness felt different, thicker, more substantial, as if it were a living thing pressing against the walls of his tent. More troubling were the dreams that kept interrupting his attempts to sleep. In these dreams, Kevin found himself walking through the forest, but it wasn't the forest they'd hiked through earlier. This was an older version of the same place, a primal landscape where the trees grew in impossible formations and the paths led to destinations that existed outside normal space and time. In his dreams, Kevin wasn't alone. He was following a figure that stayed just ahead of him, always partially obscured by shadow and distance. The figure wore what looked like a scout uniform, but the patches and insignia were wrong, symbols that hurt to look at directly and ranks that didn't exist in any official scouting manual. Danny Rodriguez was dealing with homesickness amplified by an environment that felt actively hostile to human presence. At 12, he was still young enough to seek comfort in familiar objects, and he'd brought along a small stuffed animal despite knowing that the older boys might tease him about it. But as he clutched the toy close to his chest, it seemed to offer no comfort. Instead, it felt cold and stiff, more like a dead thing than a source of warmth. Danny's tent was positioned next to Alex Kumar's, and through the thin nylon walls, he could hear the newer boy tossing restlessly in his sleeping bag. Occasionally, Alex would mutter something in his sleep, words that Danny couldn't quite make out but that sounded urgent, frightened. Billy Foster, despite his family's wealth and the confidence it usually provided, found himself thinking about mortality in ways that seemed inappropriate for a 14-year-old on a camping trip. The clearing felt like a place where important things ended, where transformations occurred that couldn't be undone. He'd brought a small camera on the trip, hoping to document their adventures, but now the idea of taking pictures in this place filled him with inexplicable dread. Jake Morrison faced a unique dilemma. As the Scoutmaster's son, he felt torn between loyalty to his father and growing concern about their situation. Jake had noticed changes in his father's behavior over the past few months, an increasing obsession with obscure aspects of wilderness lore, long periods spent studying maps and books that Jake wasn't allowed to examine, and most disturbing of all, conversations that Morrison seemed to be having with people who weren't there. As the night deepened, the subtle sounds from the clearing began to change. The underground humming grew more pronounced, and new elements joined the symphony, faint musical tones that seemed to emanate from the trees themselves, and rhythmic tapping that might have been branches moving in wind, except that there was no wind. Around midnight, several of the boys were awakened by a new sound. Morrison's voice, speaking clearly and deliberately in what sounded like a formal recitation. The words were in English, but they formed sentences that didn't quite make sense, references to preparation phases, and compatibility assessments, and threshold conditions. Tommy Chen, now fully awake, pressed his ear to the side of his tent and tried to make out what Morrison was saying. What he heard made his blood run cold. 7 candidates have been delivered according to specifications. Age range 12 to 14. Physical condition optimal. Psychological profiles suitable for processing. Beginning preliminary evaluation protocols. Expected duration of initial phase, 72 hours. Expected survival rate, variable dependent on adaptation capacity. Tommy lay frozen in his sleeping bag, his mind racing as he tried to process what he'd just heard. It sounded like Morrison was speaking to someone else, providing a report on the boys as if they were specimens in an experiment. But who could he be talking to? They were miles from any radio towers, and Tommy hadn't seen Morrison bring any communication equipment. As if in response to Tommy's thoughts, Morrison's voice came again, but this time it was different. Somehow layered as if multiple people were speaking in perfect unison. Phase 1 parameters confirmed. Subjects isolated from external support systems. Environmental controls activated. Psychic dampening field established at optimal intensity. Beginning cognitive restructuring sequence. The temperature in the clearing seemed to drop 10 degrees in an instant, and Tommy's breath began to fog inside his tent. But the cold wasn't coming from the outside air, it was emanating from the ground beneath him, as if something frozen was stirring deep underground. One by one, the boys fell into an unnatural sleep, their dreams filled with images of underground chambers, ceremonial circles, and figures in scout uniforms who wore their merit badges like medals of honor earned in battles against sanity itself. They dreamed of earning badges for skills that didn't exist in any manual: night vision, deep listening, boundary crossing, and finally, the badge they would all earn whether they wanted to or not: transformation. When morning came, if morning came, they would discover that the forest around their clearing had changed overnight, rearranging itself into patterns that defied natural law. They would learn that the path they'd followed to reach this place had disappeared, leaving them stranded in a pocket of reality that operated by rules older and crueler than those governing the world they'd left behind. But for now they slept, and in their sleep they began to change. The first thing Chen noticed when he woke was that his watch had stopped. The digital display showed 3:33 a.m., the same time it had shown when he checked it during the night. But outside his tent, light was filtering through the canopy, not the warm golden light of sunrise, but a cold, gray illumination that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Tommy unzipped his tent and crawled outside, expecting to find the other boys emerging for their morning routine. Instead, he found the clearing exactly as it had been the night before, with one significant difference: the circle of tents was perfect. Not just well-organized or approximately circular, but geometrically precise, as if each tent had been positioned by someone with surveying equipment and an obsession with mathematical accuracy. "Marcus," Tommy called softly, not wanting to wake everyone if they were still sleeping, but needing to confirm that he wasn't alone with his growing sense of wrongness about their situation. There was no response from Marcus's tent, or from any of the others. The usual sounds of boys waking up at camp, groaning, stretching, the rustling of sleeping bags, were completely absent. The silence was so complete that Tommy could hear his own heartbeat echoing strangely in his ears. Morrison's tent, positioned at what Tommy now realized was the exact center of the circle, showed no signs of life. But as Tommy watched, the tent flap moved slightly, not as if someone were pushing it from inside, but as if a gentle breeze were disturbing it. The problem was that there was no breeze. The air in the clearing was perfectly still. Tommy made a decision that would save his life, at least temporarily. Instead of investigating the other tents or approaching Morrison, he began to back away from the circle, moving toward the tree line. Something deep in his 12-year-old mind, some instinct honed by thousands of years of human evolution, was screaming at him to get away from this place. As he reached the edge of the clearing, Tommy turned to look back and felt his sanity waver. The circle of tents was no longer just geometrically precise. It was glowing. A faint phosphorescent light outlined each tent and connected them with barely visible lines of energy, creating a pattern that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the shadows cast by the tents didn't match their positions. The shadows formed a different pattern entirely, one that looked like a symbol Tommy had never seen before but somehow recognized with the same instinctive terror that had driven him away from the circle. Tommy ran. He crashed through the underbrush, abandoning any attempt at the quiet movement Morrison had taught them, caring only about putting distance between himself and whatever was happening in that clearing. Branches tore at his pajamas and scratched his face, but he kept running, guided by a panic so pure it transcended rational thought. After what felt like hours but couldn't have been more than minutes, Tommy stumbled and fell, rolling down a small slope and coming to rest against the base of a large pine tree. He lay there gasping, his heart hammering against his ribs, trying to process what he'd seen and what it might mean. As his breathing gradually slowed, Tommy became aware of his surroundings. He was in a part of the forest that looked different from what they'd hiked through the previous day. The trees here were older, their trunks thick and gnarled, their branches forming a canopy so dense that the strange gray light barely penetrated. But more unsettling was the silence, the same absolute absence of natural sound that had characterized the clearing. Tommy checked his watch again. Still 3:33 a.m. He shook it, tapped the display, even removed it from his wrist and put it back on. The time didn't change. A new fear began to creep into Tommy's mind. If his watch had stopped, how could he tell how much time was passing? How would he know when it was safe to return to the clearing, or when he should expect rescue if he didn't return at all? As if summoned by his thoughts of rescue, Tommy heard a sound that filled him with relief: human voices calling his name. But the relief lasted only seconds before transforming into something much worse. The voices were coming from the direction of the clearing, and they were calling in perfect unison. Not like a search party spreading out and coordinating their efforts, but like a chorus rehearsed to speak as one. Tommy Chen, come back to camp. It's time for your merit badge ceremony. The voice was Morrison's, but it was also the voices of the other boys, Marcus, Kevin, Danny, Jake, Billy, Alex, all speaking the exact same words at the exact same time with the exact same intonation. Tommy pressed himself against the tree trunk, biting his lip to keep from making any sound. The voices came again, closer this time. Tommy? The ceremony can't begin without all 7 participants. Come back and claim your place in the circle. Through the trees, Tommy caught glimpses of movement, figures walking through the forest in his direction. But something was wrong with the way they moved. They were too coordinated, their steps falling in perfect rhythm like soldiers on parade. And they were all the same height, as if whatever was calling to him had standardized the bodies it was using. Tommy remained hidden against the tree, watching in terror as the search party passed within 20 feet of his hiding place. In the gray half-light filtering through the canopy, he could see them clearly enough to confirm his worst fears. The figures wore scout uniforms and bore the faces of his fellow troop members, but their eyes were wrong, too bright, too knowing, reflecting light like an animal's eyes in headlight beams. The Morrison thing leading the group stopped directly in front of Tommy's tree and turned its head in his direction. For a moment, Tommy was certain he'd been discovered, but the figure's gaze passed over him without pause. When it spoke, its voice carried the authority Tommy remembered from their Scoutmaster, but underneath was something else. A harmony of whispers that seemed to come from the forest itself. Tommy Chen, it said, and the other figures repeated the name like an echo. You have been selected for advancement. Your current merit badge status is incomplete. Return to the circle for final processing. The figures stood motionless for nearly 5 minutes, and Tommy began to wonder if they were waiting for him to break cover. But gradually they began to move again, continuing their search in the wrong direction, away from his actual location. As the voices faded into the distance, Tommy allowed himself to breathe normally for the first time since waking. But relief was quickly replaced by a terrible understanding. Whatever had happened to his friends and Scoutmaster, whatever was wearing their faces and speaking with their voices, it wasn't human. And it was looking for him. Tommy spent the rest of the day, if day and night still had meaning in this place, moving through the forest trying to find the trail that had brought them to the clearing. But the landscape seemed to shift around him. Paths appearing and disappearing, familiar landmarks rearranging themselves when he wasn't looking directly at them. As what he assumed was afternoon wore on, Tommy began to hear other sounds in the forest. Not the normal sounds of wildlife, but something that might have been machinery, a low rhythmic pulsing that seemed to emanate from deep underground. And occasionally carried on air that never moved, he heard singing. Children's voices raised in songs he didn't recognize, melodies that seemed to wind through his mind like smoke, beautiful and terrible at the same time. Patricia Cole had been a forest ranger for 15 years, and in that time, she'd conducted dozens of search and rescue operations. She'd found lost hikers, injured climbers, and confused elderly people who'd wandered away from camping trips. But she'd never experienced anything like the search for Troop 247. The first problem was locating their actual campsite. Morrison had told parents they would be staying at Campsite 47, but when rescue teams reached that location, they found it completely undisturbed. No tire tracks from Morrison's van, no footprints, no evidence that anyone had been there recently. A wider search revealed Morrison's van parked at an unmarked trailhead nearly 15 miles from Campsite 47. The vehicle was unlocked, keys in the ignition, but empty of both people and most of the camping gear. A search of the area revealed a faint trail leading deeper into the forest, but it seemed to peter out after about a mile, dissolving into ordinary woodland with no clear direction of travel. Detective Sarah Walsh arrived on scene with her partner, Detective Mike Torres, at 10:30 a.m. They'd worked missing persons cases before, but something about this one felt different from the start. The forest was too quiet for one thing. Even accounting for the presence of search teams and helicopters, there should have been more wildlife activity. Instead, the woods felt empty, abandoned. "Have you found any signs of the campsite?" Walsh asked Ranger Cole as they met at the van. "That's the problem," Cole replied, consulting her clipboard of search grid assignments. "We can't find where they actually camped. This trail." She pointed toward the path leading away from the van. "It's not on any of our maps. And the GPS coordinates Morrison gave the parents don't match any established camping areas." Detective Torres was examining the van's interior, noting the absence of Morrison's personal effects. No radio, no emergency beacon, no cell phone. Either Morrison was incredibly careless about safety protocols, or he deliberately cut off all means of communication. As the search expanded throughout the day, teams began reporting strange phenomena that would never make it into official reports. Compasses spun wildly in certain areas as if magnetic north kept shifting. Search dogs became agitated and refused to follow scent trails that led in specific directions. Most disturbing of all, several searchers reported hearing voices calling for help, but when they followed the sounds they found no one. By evening, over 200 volunteers had joined the search, including parents of the missing boys. Margaret and David Chen had driven up from town as soon as they received word of the disappearance, and Margaret hadn't stopped moving since her arrival, as if motion could somehow bring her son back through sheer force of will. "He's a smart boy," she told Detective Walsh as they stood at the command post that had been established near Morrison's abandoned van. "Tommy wouldn't just wander off. If he's lost, he'd stay in one place and wait for help. He knows better than to keep moving and get more lost." David Chen was more direct in his suspicions. "Morrison did something," he said flatly. "I never liked him. Too intense, too controlling. And the way he looked at the boys, like he was studying them." These concerns were shared by other parents, but without evidence of foul play, the investigation had to proceed as a standard search and rescue operation. What the parents didn't know was that Detective Walsh had already begun treating Morrison as a person of interest rather than a victim. Tommy Chen had no way to know that above ground hundreds of people were searching for him and his fellow scouts. His world had shrunk to the immediate necessities of survival: finding water, avoiding the things that hunted him through the forest, and trying to maintain his sanity in an environment that seemed designed to erode rational thought. The strange sounds from underground had grown stronger over what Tommy estimated to be several days. The mechanical pulsing was now accompanied by what sounded like construction noises: drilling, hammering, the movement of heavy machinery. But when Tommy pressed his ear to the ground, the sounds seemed to be coming from impossible depths, as if an entire industrial operation was taking place miles beneath the forest floor. More troubling were the changes to the forest itself. Trees that Tommy was certain he'd passed earlier now stood in different locations. Streams appeared and disappeared overnight. Most unsettling of all, Tommy had begun to find evidence of other campsites. Not recent ones but old camping spots with fire rings and tent impressions that looked decades old, yet showed no signs of weathering or overgrowth. At one of these sites, Tommy made a discovery that nearly broke his remaining composure. Scattered among the leaves and debris were merit badges. Not the standard Boy Scout badges he was familiar with, but older versions with different designs and symbols he didn't recognize. The badges were in various states of decay, but several were still readable enough to make out names and dates. William Crawford 1952. Timothy Walsh 1961. Robert Kim 1967. David Martinez 1974. Tommy stared at the badges for a long time, his mind trying to process the implications. If these belonged to other scouts who had been brought to this place, what had happened to them? And why were their merit badges scattered like trophies or memorials? As Tommy pondered these questions, he became aware that he was no longer alone. The sensation of being watched, which had been a constant companion since his escape from the clearing, had intensified. But this time the presence felt different, not malevolent like the Morrison thing and its companions but sad, desperate. "Hello," Tommy whispered, barely audible even to himself. A rustling in the underbrush caught his attention, and Tommy turned to see a figure emerging from behind a large oak tree. It was a boy about his own age, wearing a scout uniform that looked like it belonged in a museum. The boy's merit badge sash was covered with patches Tommy didn't recognize, and his eyes held a depth of exhaustion that no child should possess. "You shouldn't have come here," the boy said, his voice carrying a strange echo as if he were speaking from the bottom of a well. "This is a place for earning badges, but not the kind you want." Tommy's mouth was too dry to respond, but he managed to croak out a single word: "Who?" "Timothy Walsh," the boy replied, and Tommy's eyes went to one of the merit badges scattered on the ground. "Eagle Scout, Troop 189. I've been here since 1961. I've earned every badge there is to earn, and some that don't exist in your world. But I can't leave until I find 7 others to take my place." The implications of Timothy's words hit Tommy like a physical blow. "The others? Marcus, Kevin, Danny?" "They're learning," Timothy said sadly. "Mr. Morrison is teaching them about the badges they never knew they wanted. The Deep Woods Merit Badge. The Underground Merit Badge. The Forever Merit Badge. Each one requires them to give up a little more of what they used to be. Tommy forced himself to stand, though his legs felt like they might collapse at any moment. Where are they? Can I help them? Timothy shook his head slowly. They're below. In the chambers where the real work happens. Morrison brings groups every few years, and the best candidates are selected for advancement. The others? Timothy gestured toward the scattered merit badges. They earn their final badge and get to rest. I have to try to help them, Tommy said, surprised by the strength in his own voice. Timothy studied him for a long moment, and something like hope flickered in his ancient eyes. There might be a way, he said finally. But it would mean earning a badge that very few scouts have ever attempted. The Rescue Merit Badge. The requirements are challenging. 2 miles beneath the forest floor, in chambers carved from living rock by tools that hadn't been used by humans in thousands of years, 6 boys sat in perfect silence around a circular table. Their scout uniforms were cleaner than they'd been on the surface, pressed and neat as if they were attending a formal ceremony. Their merit badge sashes displayed patches that changed design when looked at directly, symbols that hurt to contemplate for too long. Marcus Williams, who had been the natural leader of the group, now spoke only when asked direct questions. His eyes, once bright with intelligence and curiosity, had taken on a glassy quality, as if he were looking at something infinitely far away. The merit badge at the center of his sash read Compliance, in letters that seemed to writhe and shift. Kevin Hartley sat with perfect posture, his hands folded in his lap, his breathing so regular it seemed mechanical. The badge on his uniform said, Observation, and indeed, Kevin's gaze moved constantly around the chamber, cataloging details and filing them away in a mind that no longer entirely belonged to him. Danny Rodriguez, the youngest of the group, had stopped crying on the 3rd day underground. Now he smiled constantly, an expression that never reached his eyes, which had taken on a flat, reptilian quality. His newest badge was labeled Adaptation, and he wore it with obvious pride. Jake Morrison sat directly across from his father, who presided over the table like a perverted parody of a Scoutmaster conducting a troop meeting. But the man who had driven them into the forest was no longer entirely Robert Morrison. His body had been modified for its new role, elongated and refined to better accommodate the intelligence that now inhabited it. Billy Foster and Alex Kumar completed the circle, their individual personalities subsumed into a collective identity that responded to the Morrison Thing's instructions with perfect synchronization. They had earned badges for unity and purpose, respectively, and the pride they felt in these achievements was genuine, even if it was no longer entirely their own emotion. Gentlemen, the Morrison Thing said, its voice carrying harmonics that resonated in frequencies human ears weren't designed to process. You have made excellent progress in your merit badge advancement. However, we still have one candidate who has not reported for processing. The 6 boys turned their heads in perfect unison to look at an empty 7th chair at the table. Their expressions showed no concern or curiosity about Tommy's absence, only a patient certainty that he would eventually take his place among them. Tommy Chen's participation is required for the completion of your advancement, the Morrison Thing continued. Without a full complement of 7 scouts, the final ceremony cannot proceed, and you cannot earn your most important badge of all. Marcus raised his hand with mechanical precision. What is our most important badge, Mr. Morrison? The Morrison Thing smiled, an expression that revealed far too many teeth. The Eternity Merit Badge, Marcus. The badge that recognizes scouts who have learned to serve purposes larger than their individual existence. The badge that transforms temporary human children into permanent guardians of knowledge that predates your species. The boys nodded in unison, their faces showing the kind of serene acceptance that came from having most of their individual will systematically removed. But somewhere in the deeper chambers, in rooms that existed in the spaces between normal geometry, other voices were stirring. The voices of boys who had sat at similar tables in decades past, boys who had earned their final badges and been granted eternal rest, boys who remembered just enough of their former humanity to feel something approaching regret. Timothy Walsh, who had been 12 years old in 1961 and had never aged a day since, heard the Morrison Thing's words through walls of stone and time. He had helped other scouts escape over the years, not many, but enough to maintain his own flickering hope that the cycle might someday be broken. But Tommy Chen was different from the others. Timothy had tried to help. Tommy had questions where others had only fear, curiosity where others had only desperation. And most importantly, Tommy had managed to avoid the initial processing that had claimed his fellow scouts. As Timothy prepared to teach Tommy the requirements for the Rescue Merit Badge, he wondered if this might finally be the scout who could earn them all their freedom, or if Tommy would simply become the seventh chair at the eternal table, completing another cycle in a process that had been ongoing since before human beings discovered fire. In a grove of trees that existed slightly outside normal spacetime, Tommy Chen listened as Timothy Walsh explained the most dangerous merit badge requirements ever conceived. The Rescue Merit Badge can only be attempted by a scout who has maintained his individual will while exposed to the influence of the deep chambers, Timothy began, his voice carrying the weight of decades of hard-won knowledge. You qualify because you escaped before the initial processing could begin. Tommy sat cross-legged on the forest floor, trying to absorb information that challenged everything he thought he knew about scouting, about the world, about the nature of reality itself. What do I have to do? Tommy asked, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. Timothy pulled out a merit badge unlike any in the official handbook. Instead of a simple embroidered patch, this badge seemed to be made of crystallized shadow, its surface reflecting not light but something deeper, memories perhaps, or the accumulated hope of generations of trapped scouts. First, Timothy said, you must descend to the deep chambers without being detected by the Morrison thing or its converted scouts. This requires earning the Stealth Merit Badge. Timothy held up a badge that seemed to bend light around itself, making it difficult to focus on directly. Second, you must locate the Chamber of Transformation where your fellow scouts are being held, and you must remain unaffected by the psychological modifications being performed on them. This requires the Resistance Merit Badge. Another badge appeared in Timothy's hand, this one seeming to pulse with a faint inner light that hurt to look at for too long. Third, Tommy said, you must disrupt the ceremony that converts individual human consciousness into components of a collective entity. This requires earning the Disruption Merit Badge. The third badge Timothy displayed seemed to flicker in and out of existence, as if it couldn't maintain a stable form in normal reality. And finally, Timothy concluded, you must guide your fellow scouts back to the surface world while preventing the entity that controls this place from following them. This requires the Guardian Merit Badge. The final badge was different from the others. Instead of a single patch, it was a complex arrangement of interconnected symbols that seemed to move and rearrange themselves as Tommy watched. Tommy stared at the 4 badges, understanding instinctively that attempting to earn them would likely result in his death or worse. But the alternative, abandoning Marcus, Kevin, Danny, Jake, Billy and Alex to whatever fate awaited them in the deep chambers, was unthinkable. How do I start? Tommy asked. Timothy smiled for the first time since Tommy had met him, and for just a moment, he looked like the 12-year-old boy he had once been instead of the ageless guardian of terrible knowledge he had become. With the first requirement of the Stealth Merit Badge, Timothy said, learn to move through this forest without disturbing the things that hunt here. Learn to become invisible to senses that operate beyond normal human perception. Learn to walk between the spaces where reality is thin. And so Tommy Chen's real scout training began. Above ground, the official search for Troop 247 had entered its 6th day. The initial urgency had given way to a grim determination as the search area expanded beyond the boundaries of Pine Ridge National Forest into surrounding state lands and private property. Detective Sarah Walsh had taken over as lead investigator when it became clear that this was more than a simple case of lost campers. Her investigation into Robert Morrison's background had revealed several troubling inconsistencies. Morrison's employment records showed gaps of several months every few years, periods when he claimed to be conducting independent wilderness research. His references from previous employers described him as competent but oddly intense, prone to talking about alternative approaches to youth development that made parents uncomfortable. Most disturbing was the discovery of Morrison's personal library, found when police searched his apartment. Along with normal scouting manuals and wilderness guides, Morrison had collected dozens of books on topics that seemed to have no connection to legitimate outdoor education. Medieval grimoires, texts on ritual magic, and several volumes that appeared to be handwritten accounts of something called the Deep Teaching Method. One book in particular caught Walsh's attention. It was bound in leather that felt disturbingly warm to the touch, and its pages contained what appeared to be blueprints for underground structures, along with detailed notes about preparation phases, psychological conditioning protocols, and sacrifice requirements for entity appeasement. But physical evidence remained frustratingly scarce. The trail leading away from Morrison's van had been searched repeatedly by teams using everything from bloodhounds to ground-penetrating radar, but no trace of the missing group had been found. It was as if they had simply walked into the forest and ceased to exist. Margaret Chen had not returned home since receiving word of the disappearance. She spent her days at the search command post, monitoring radio communications and studying maps with the desperate intensity of someone who believed she could will her son back into existence through sheer force of concentration. "There has to be something we're missing," she told Detective Walsh during one of their daily briefings. "Tommy is resourceful. If he were just lost, he would have found his way back by now, or at least left some sign of where he'd been." Walsh nodded, though privately she was beginning to suspect that Tommy and the other boys were beyond the reach of any conventional search effort. The physical evidence suggested that whatever had happened to them, it had occurred in a place that didn't appear on any map and might not be entirely connected to the normal world. Deep in the forest that existed in the margins between realities, Tommy Chen was learning skills that no scout manual had ever documented. Under Timothy Walsh's guidance, he was discovering how to move through an environment where the rules of physics were more like suggestions, where willpower could be as important as physical strength, and where the greatest dangers were often invisible to normal senses. The first lesson involved learning to recognize the boundaries between normal forest and the areas where reality grew thin. Timothy taught Tommy to watch for subtle signs, trees that grew in impossible formations, shadows that fell in the wrong directions, and most importantly, the complete absence of natural sounds that characterized zones under the entity's direct influence. "The thing that controls this place, we call it the Scoutmaster, doesn't perceive the world the way humans do," Timothy explained as they practiced moving silently through a grove of trees that seemed to lean inward like eavesdroppers. "It senses intention, fear, desperation. If you approach the deep chambers with rescue in your heart, it will detect you immediately." "Then how do I save them?" Tommy asked, frustrated by the apparent contradiction. "You learn to want something else more than rescue," Timothy replied cryptically. "You learn to desire their freedom so strongly that your individual desire to save them becomes secondary. It's the difference between taking something and giving something away." This philosophical approach to stealth took Tommy several days to master. He had to learn to empty his mind of specific goals while maintaining a deeper sense of purpose, to move through the forest like water flowing downhill, following the path of least resistance while still progressing toward his destination. The second requirement for the Stealth Merit Badge was even more challenging. Tommy had to learn to become temporarily invisible to supernatural perception. This didn't involve any kind of physical camouflage, but rather a mental discipline that Timothy called existence minimization. "Think of yourself as a shadow cast by someone who isn't there," Timothy instructed. "Present but not substantial. Observable but not important. The Scoutmaster's attention slides past things that don't assert their reality too strongly." This technique required Tommy to suppress his natural 12-year-old impulses toward curiosity and self-assertion. He had to learn to observe without forming opinions, to move without announcing his presence through micro-expressions or unconscious body language that supernatural entities could read from impossible distances. After a week of intensive training, Tommy successfully demonstrated his mastery of supernatural stealth by walking within 10 feet of the Morrison thing without being detected. The entity was conducting what appeared to be a perimeter patrol, its modified form moving through the forest with predatory grace while its enhanced senses scanned for any sign of the missing seventh scout. Tommy watched from concealment as the Morrison thing paused at the exact spot where he was hiding, its head turning in his direction with mechanical precision. For a moment, Tommy was certain he'd been discovered. But the entity's gaze passed over him without pause, as if he were just another tree or boulder in the landscape. When the Morrison thing moved on, Tommy allowed himself a moment of triumph. He had earned his first impossible merit badge. Armed with supernatural stealth abilities, Tommy began the most dangerous phase of his rescue mission, infiltrating the underground complex where his fellow scouts were being held and transformed. Timothy had provided him with a crude map of the tunnel system, drawn from memory and decades of cautious exploration. The entrance to the deep chambers was located beneath the clearing where they had originally made camp. What had appeared to be solid ground was actually a sophisticated camouflage covering a spiral staircase that descended deep into the earth. But accessing this entrance required Tommy to cross the clearing undetected, and the area was constantly monitored by converted scouts who served as guards. Tommy spent an entire day observing the patrol patterns of his former friends. Marcus, Kevin, and Danny took turns walking the perimeter of the clearing, their movements synchronized with mechanical precision. Their scout uniforms were pristine, their merit badge sashes displaying patches that seemed to move and change when observed peripherally. But what struck Tommy most forcefully was the complete absence of individual personality in their movements and expressions. The boys he had known for years, Marcus with his natural leadership instincts, Kevin with his quiet observational skills, Danny with his eager-to-please enthusiasm, had been replaced by identical components of a larger system. Tommy waited until the patrol rotation shifted, then used his newly acquired stealth skills to cross the clearing during the 3-minute gap between guards. The entrance to the underground complex was exactly where Timothy had indicated, a section of earth that looked solid but gave way when approached with the correct combination of intention and disbelief. The staircase beyond was carved from living rock and descended at a steep angle that seemed to violate normal geometry. As Tommy made his way down, he began to hear sounds from below, the mechanical pulsing that had been audible from the surface, but also voices engaged in what sounded like a formal recitation. The voices belonged to his fellow scouts, but they were speaking in unison, reciting words in a language Tommy didn't recognize. The cadence was hypnotic, and Tommy found himself beginning to lose focus as the alien syllables worked their way into his consciousness. He bit his tongue hard enough to draw blood, using the pain to maintain his mental clarity. At the bottom of the staircase, Tommy found himself in a circular chamber with 7 tunnels leading away in different directions. Each tunnel was marked with a symbol that seemed to writhe and shift when looked at directly, but Timothy had warned him about this and taught him to navigate by peripheral vision and intuitive guidance rather than direct observation. The tunnel Tommy needed led to the Chamber of Transformation, where the final stages of scout conversion were conducted. But as he made his way through passages that seemed to exist in more than 3 dimensions, Tommy began to understand that rescuing his friends would require more than simply finding them and leading them to safety. The boys he had known were being systematically dismantled and rebuilt according to specifications that served purposes beyond human comprehension. Simply reversing the process might not be possible, and attempting to do so might destroy what remained of their individual consciousness entirely. Tommy's first glimpse of the Chamber of Transformation nearly broke his resolve entirely. The room was vast, its ceiling disappearing into darkness above, its walls covered with symbols that seemed to move and rearrange themselves according to some cosmic logic that human minds weren't designed to understand. At the center of the chamber stood a circular table where 6 boys sat in perfect silence, their faces serene with the kind of peace that came from having all difficult decisions removed from their lives. Their scout uniforms were immaculate, their posture identical, their breathing synchronized to a rhythm that matched the mechanical pulsing Tommy had been hearing since his first night in the forest. The Morrison thing presided over the table from a position that might once have been called the head, but the entity's form had undergone further modifications since Tommy had last seen it. It was taller now, its limbs elongated beyond normal human proportions, its face bearing features that belonged to no single species. When it spoke, its voice carried harmonics that seemed to originate from multiple throats. "Brothers," the Morrison thing was saying as Tommy watched from concealment behind a pillar that existed in several dimensions simultaneously, "you have progressed admirably in your merit badge advancement. Your individual achievements in compliance, observation, adaptation, unity, purpose, and dedication are exemplary. But to earn your final badge, the badge that will grant you eternal purpose, we require the participation of your 7th brother." The 6 boys turned their heads in perfect unison toward the empty chair that had been reserved for Tommy. Their expressions showed no concern or curiosity about his absence, only a patient certainty that he would eventually take his place among them. Tommy Chen's resistance to the gathering process demonstrates qualities that will make his eventual integration even more valuable, the Morrison thing continued. When he joins us, and he will join us, his contributions to our collective consciousness will provide the final component necessary for the Great Merit Badge. Marcus Williams, who had once been Tommy's friend and protector, spoke in a voice that carried no trace of his former personality. "What is the Great Merit Badge, Mr. Morrison?" The Morrison thing's smile revealed teeth that weren't entirely teeth and weren't entirely something else. The Great Merit Badge recognizes scouts who have transcended the limitations of individual existence to serve as eternal guardians of knowledge that predates human civilization. Those who earn this badge become permanent residents of the spaces between worlds, shepherds of truths too dangerous for ordinary minds to comprehend. Tommy felt his newly acquired stealth training begin to slip as horror and rage flooded through him. The boys sitting at that table weren't being educated or transformed, they were being consumed, their individual consciousness processed into components of something vast and hungry and utterly alien to human experience. But even as Tommy struggled to maintain his invisibility to supernatural perception, he noticed something that gave him hope. The conversion process wasn't complete. In brief moments when the boys weren't directly focused on the Morrison thing's words, Tommy caught glimpses of their real personalities flickering beneath the imposed uniformity. Kevin's eyes would narrow slightly with his characteristic analytical expression. Danny would start to smile with genuine warmth before catching himself and returning to the prescribed neutral expression. Most encouragingly, Jake Morrison, sitting directly across from his transformed father, occasionally showed signs of active resistance. His hands would clench into fists when the Morrison thing spoke, and his breathing would become irregular, as if he were fighting against the psychological conditioning through sheer force of will. Tommy realized that earning the Resistance Merit Badge would require him to do more than simply avoid being affected by the entity's influence. He would need to actively disrupt the conversion process, to provide his friends with enough external support to reclaim their individual will. But first, he needed to understand exactly what he was fighting against. Hidden in the margins of the Chamber of Transformation, Tommy listened as the Morrison thing continued its perverted merit badge ceremony. But as the entity spoke, Tommy began to piece together the true nature of what had captured his scout troop and dozens of others over the decades. The Scoutmaster wasn't a single creature, but rather a collective consciousness that existed in the spaces between normal reality. It fed on the potential energy of young minds, specifically, minds that had been trained in the structured thinking patterns that scouting encouraged. The merit badge system, with its emphasis on step-by-step skill acquisition and systematic achievement, created the perfect framework for the entity's psychological conversion process. Every few years, the Scoutmaster would identify a suitable group of scouts and arrange for them to be brought to locations where the boundaries between worlds grew thin. It would then use modified Scoutmasters, humans who had been partially converted but retained enough individual will to function in normal society, to lure groups of boys into areas where the entity's influence was strongest. The conversion process itself was a grotesque parody of legitimate merit badge advancement. Boys were required to earn badges for increasingly abstract concepts: compliance, observation, unity, until their individual personalities were subsumed into components of the collective consciousness. The final stage involved earning the Great Merit Badge, which completed the transformation and granted the entity permanent access to their memories, skills, and life force. But the Scoutmaster's greatest secret was its vulnerability. The conversion process required the willing participation of exactly 7 subjects. Groups of 6 or 8 might be partially converted, but they couldn't be fully integrated into the collective consciousness. This was why Tommy's escape had disrupted the entire operation, why the entity was so desperate to recapture him. As Tommy absorbed this information, he began to understand the true requirements for the Resistance Merit Badge. He wouldn't just need to avoid being converted himself, he would need to help his friends resist the conversion process by reminding them of who they had been before their capture. The challenge was that doing so would require him to abandon his supernatural stealth and reveal his presence in the chamber. Once the Scoutmaster became aware of his location, Tommy would have only minutes before overwhelming force was brought to bear against him. But as Tommy watched his friends sitting in perfect, unnatural silence around the transformation table, he realized that he couldn't allow them to remain in this state. Even if attempting to rescue them resulted in his own capture, he had to try. Tommy Chen, age 12, began to earn the most dangerous merit badge in the history of scouting. Tommy's plan was simple in concept but terrifying in execution. He would need to enter the Chamber of Transformation openly, disrupt the conversion ceremony by appealing to his friends' suppressed memories, and then guide them through an escape attempt while the Scoutmaster was still reeling from the unexpected assault on its psychological control systems. The key to earning the Resistance Merit Badge was understanding that the entity's power came from isolation and despair. Boys who believed they were alone, abandoned, and helpless were easily converted into components of the collective consciousness. But boys who remembered that they were valued, loved, and capable of individual choice could resist even the most sophisticated psychological conditioning. Tommy spent his final day of preparation reviewing everything he remembered about his fellow scouts. Not just their names and ages, but their dreams, fears, personalities, and the small details that made them unique individuals rather than interchangeable components. He remembered Marcus's determination to become an Eagle Scout like his older brother. He recalled Kevin's habit of making detailed observations that others missed. He thought about Danny's fierce loyalty to his friends and his desire to prove himself worthy of their respect. Most importantly, he focused on Jake Morrison, the Scoutmaster's son who had shown the strongest signs of resistance to the conversion process. If Tommy could reach Jake first, he might be able to create a chain reaction of awakening consciousness that would disrupt the entire ceremony. As what he estimated to be evening approached in the world above, Tommy made his way back to the Chamber of Transformation. The 6 converted scouts were seated around the table in their usual formation, with the Morrison thing conducting what appeared to be an advanced lesson in collective consciousness integration. Individual memory creates the illusion of separation, the entity was explaining in its harmonically layered voice. But as you progress toward earning your Great Merit Badge, you will learn to share not just thoughts and experiences, but the very essence of what you once believed made you unique. Marcus, demonstrate the unity breathing technique. Marcus Williams began breathing in perfect synchronization with some inaudible rhythm, his chest rising and falling with mechanical precision. The other boys immediately matched his pattern, creating a collective breathing exercise that seemed to produce a faint resonance in the chamber's acoustics. Tommy waited until the breathing exercise reached its deepest phase, when the boy's individual consciousness would be at its most suppressed. Then he abandoned his supernatural stealth and walked openly into the chamber. "That's not how we learn to breathe during our CPR merit badge training," Tommy said clearly, his voice echoing off the impossible walls of the transformation chamber. The effect was immediate and dramatic. All 6 boys jerked as if they'd been electrically shocked, their synchronized breathing pattern breaking apart into individual rhythms. The Morrison thing spun toward Tommy with inhuman speed, its modified features contorting with rage and something that might have been fear. "Tommy Chen," the entity said, and its voice now carried undertones of barely controlled fury. "You have delayed your processing long enough. Take your place at the table and begin earning your compliance merit badge." But Tommy was already moving, circling the table and making eye contact with each of his friends in turn. "Marcus," he said, "remember when you helped me with my knot tying practice before our first camping trip? You said the key to a good bowlin' was remembering the story about the rabbit and the tree." Marcus blinked, and for just a moment, confusion flickered across his features. "Rabbit?" he murmured, then shook his head as if clearing it. "The rabbit comes up through the hole around the tree and back down through the hole." The Morrison thing let out a sound that was part growl, part electronic interference. "Ignore the disruptor," it commanded. "Continue the unity breathing exercise. Focus on collective rhythm." But Tommy was already moving to the next chair. "Kevin," he said, locking eyes with his quiet friend, "remember when we were working on our astronomy merit badge? You were the only one who could find the Little Dipper on that cloudy night. You said it was because you looked for what wasn't there instead of what was." Kevin's head jerked up, his eyes widening as individual thought began to reassert itself. I remember stars," he whispered. "Real stars, not the symbols on the ceiling here." "Danny," Tommy continued, ignoring the Morrison thing's increasingly frantic commands for order, "you brought your sister's rosary on every camping trip because your mom told you it would keep you safe. You were embarrassed about it, but you showed it to me that night we got scared during the thunderstorm." Danny's hand went automatically to his pocket, feeling for the familiar shape of the beaded chain. When his fingers found it still there, tears began streaming down his face. "Maria gave this to me," he said, his voice thick with returning emotion. She said to pray for her when I was far from home." The psychological dam was beginning to crack. The Morrison thing abandoned its attempts at maintaining ceremony and began moving toward Tommy with predatory intent. But Tommy had one more card to play, the most important one. "Jake," Tommy said, turning to face the Scoutmaster's son, "your dad used to be different. Before the dream started, before he began studying those books he wouldn't let you see. Remember the camping trip last summer when he taught us how to identify edible plants? He was so excited when you found those wild blueberries that he called your mom from the ranger station just to tell her how proud he was. Jake Morrison's composure shattered completely. He looked at the thing that wore his father's face, then back at Tommy, and the recognition in his eyes was terrible to witness. "That's not my dad," he said in a broken voice. "My dad is gone, isn't he?" The Morrison thing had heard enough. It lunged toward Tommy with movements that defied human anatomy, its elongated limbs reaching across the table with impossible speed. But Tommy had been expecting this moment, preparing for it throughout his training with Timothy Walsh. As the entity's hands closed around him, Tommy made no attempt to resist physically. Instead, he did something that the Scoutmaster's vast collective intelligence hadn't anticipated. He began to recite the Scout Oath, not as a mindless repetition, but as a declaration of individual will and moral purpose. "On my honor, I will do my best," Tommy said clearly, his voice carrying throughout the chamber despite the Morrison thing's grip, "to do my duty to God and my country, to obey the Scout law, to help other people at all times, to keep myself physically strong, mentally awake, and morally straight." The effect on the chamber was immediate and catastrophic. The symbols covering the walls began to flicker and fade, as if Tommy's recitation was disrupting the fundamental energy that maintained the space. The collective consciousness that bound the converted scouts together wavered, and for the first time in months, 6 boys began to think their own thoughts simultaneously. The Morrison thing's howl of rage contained harmonics that operated beyond human hearing, but Tommy had earned his resistance merit badge. The entity's psychological attacks, designed to break down individual will, passed through him without effect because he had anchored his sense of self to something larger than his own fears and desires. "Billy," Tommy called out as the Morrison thing struggled to maintain its hold on him, "remember why you wanted to be a scout in the first place. Alex, remember your first campfire, how excited you were to finally belong somewhere." Both boys jerked upright, their eyes clearing as individual memory reasserted itself against the collective programming. Billy looked down at his merit badge sash with horror, recognizing the alien symbols for what they were. Alex began tearing at his uniform, trying to remove patches that seemed to burn against his skin. The chamber was in chaos now. The Scoutmaster's control over its converted subjects was breaking down as each boy rediscovered his individual identity. But Tommy knew this was only the beginning of their escape attempt. Getting out of the deep chambers would require earning 2 more impossible merit badges, and the entity wouldn't make the same mistake twice. With 6 boys now partially awakened from their psychological conditioning, Tommy faced the challenge of actually getting them out of the transformation chamber. The Morrison thing had released him during the chaos of the collective consciousness breakdown, but it was already beginning to adapt to this new situation. Secondary containment protocols activated, the entity announced, and suddenly the chamber's walls began moving inward, contracting like the inside of a giant fist. Individual consciousness aberration detected. Initiating emergency reprocessing procedures. Tommy realized that simply awakening his friend's individual awareness wasn't enough to earn the disruption merit badge. He needed to actually destroy the Scoutmaster's ability to maintain control over this space, to break the fundamental systems that allowed the entity to exist between worlds. But how do you disrupt something that operates according to rules beyond human understanding? The answer came to Tommy as he watched his friends struggling to maintain their restored identities against the renewed psychological pressure. The Scoutmaster's power came from perverting the structure and traditions of legitimate scouting, using familiar forms and symbols to mask its alien agenda. But that dependence on recognizable patterns was also its weakness. "Everyone," Tommy shouted over the sound of contracting walls and the Morrison thing's inhuman vocalizations, "we're going to hold an actual scout meeting. Right here, right now. Marcus, you're our patrol leader. Call us to order." Marcus looked confused, his partially restored consciousness struggling to process the request. But somewhere deep in his mind, muscle memory and 3 years of scouting experience kicked in. "Troop 247, attention." Marcus called out, his voice gaining strength as he spoke familiar words. "We'll begin our meeting with the Pledge of Allegiance." The effect was immediate and profound. As 6 boys recited words they had spoken hundreds of times before, the chamber's contracting walls shuddered and stopped moving. The alien symbols covering the surfaces began to flicker more rapidly, as if the introduction of genuine human ritual was disrupting their ability to maintain coherent form. The Morrison thing let out another harmonically complex scream. "Cease this disruption immediately. You are interfering with essential processing protocols." But Tommy was already moving to the next phase of his plan. "Kevin, lead us in the Scout law," he commanded. Kevin stepped forward, his analytical mind seizing on the familiar structure of recitation. A Scout is trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent. With each word, the chamber's reality became less stable. The impossible architecture began to shift and waver, revealing glimpses of ordinary limestone caves beneath the supernatural overlay. The Scoutmaster had built its power by corrupting legitimate scouting traditions, but when those traditions were practiced with genuine intent and collective will, they generated a kind of psychic interference that the entity couldn't overcome. "Jake," Tommy called out, "your dad used to end every meeting the same way. Remember what he would say?" Jake Morrison looked at the thing that wore his father's face, then back at his fellow scouts. When he spoke, it was with the voice of the boy he had been before months of psychological conditioning had nearly erased his identity. "A scout is prepared," Jake said firmly. "And we're prepared to go home." The transformation chamber exploded. Not literally, the walls didn't physically blast apart, but the supernatural space that the Scoutmaster had constructed to house its conversion operations simply ceased to exist. Tommy and his friends found themselves standing in an ordinary cave, surrounded by limestone formations and the kind of natural beauty that made Pine Ridge National Forest famous. But they weren't free yet. The Morrison thing was still present, its form now revealed as something that had never been entirely human. And from deeper in the cave system, Tommy could hear other voices, the collective consciousness of every scout group that had been captured over the decades, calling for the escapees to return and complete their processing. Tommy had earned his disruption merit badge by breaking the Scoutmaster's immediate control over their environment. But getting his friends safely back to the surface world would require mastering the most dangerous skill of all. The requirements for the Guardian Merit Badge were unlike anything in legitimate scouting literature. A scout attempting to earn this badge had to demonstrate the ability to protect others from supernatural threats while maintaining his own moral integrity, to serve as a barrier between innocent people and forces that operated beyond normal human understanding. But most challenging of all, earning the Guardian Merit Badge required the scout to make a sacrifice, to give up something precious in order to ensure the safety of those under his protection. As Tommy led his awakened friends through the limestone caves that lay beneath the Scoutmaster's constructed reality, he began to understand what his sacrifice would need to be. The entity wasn't going to simply let them leave. It would pursue them, and it would continue to capture other groups of scouts until someone found a way to stop it permanently. The cave system was extensive, with passages leading in multiple directions and chambers that seemed to exist in several dimensions simultaneously. Tommy's supernatural training with Timothy Walsh had prepared him to navigate such spaces, but his friends were still partially disoriented from their psychological conditioning. "Stay close," Tommy instructed as they made their way through a narrow tunnel that led steadily upward toward what he hoped was the surface. "Don't look directly at any symbols you might see on the walls, and if you hear voices calling your name, don't respond." Behind them, the sounds of pursuit were growing louder. The Morrison thing was following, along with what sounded like dozens of other entities, the collective consciousness of every scout group that had been successfully converted over the decades. "Tommy Chen," came a voice from the darkness behind them, and Tommy recognized it as belonging to one of the converted scouts from the 1960s. "You cannot escape the deep teaching. You cannot deny the merit badges you have already earned. Return to us and accept your place in the Eternal Patrol." But Tommy had learned something during his time with Timothy Walsh. The converted scouts weren't entirely evil. They were victims, trapped by an entity that fed on their potential and transformed their genuine desire to serve others into something monstrous. If he could find a way to break the Scoutmaster's control permanently, he might be able to free not just his own friends, but every scout who had been captured over the decades. The question was whether he was brave enough to attempt it. As they climbed toward the surface, Tommy began to explain his plan to the others. "There's a way to stop this permanently," he said, "but it means one of us has to stay behind." "No," Marcus said immediately. "We all go home or none of us do. That's what you taught us when you came to rescue us." The Scoutmaster needs 7 scouts to complete its processing cycle, Tommy continued. But it also needs 7 scouts to maintain its existence in our reality. If I go back and take my place at the transformation table, but I maintain my individual will instead of being converted, it creates a paradox that the entity can't resolve. Jake Morrison, who understood better than the others what they were truly facing, shook his head. You're talking about trapping yourself down there forever. Not forever, Tommy replied, though he wasn't entirely certain this was true. Just long enough for you to reach the surface and bring back help. Real help, people who understand what we're dealing with and know how to fight it. They were nearing the cave entrance now, and natural sunlight was beginning to filter down from above. But the sounds of pursuit were getting closer, and Tommy could sense the Scoutmaster's growing desperation as its converted subjects approached the boundary between worlds. At the cave mouth, Tommy made his decision. He turned to face his friends, and his expression was calm with the kind of peace that comes from choosing to do the right thing regardless of personal cost. I'm going back, he said simply. Get to the surface. Find help. Come back for me when you can. Tommy, no, Danny Rodriguez said, tears streaming down his face. We won't leave you behind. But Tommy was already moving back into the cave, retracing their steps toward the deeper chambers where the Scoutmaster waited. Take care of each other, he called over his shoulder. And remember, you're scouts. You're prepared for anything. The last thing Tommy heard before the cave entrance sealed itself behind him was Marcus Williams calling out, We'll be back for you. I promise. Tommy Chen, age 12, walked alone into the darkness to earn his final merit badge. Patricia Cole was conducting her morning patrol of Pine Ridge National Forest when she heard voices calling for help from the direction of the old limestone caves near Sector 7. She'd been working this area for 15 years, and she'd never heard human voices coming from those particular caves, which were generally considered too dangerous for recreational exploration. What she found changed her understanding of what was possible in the natural world. 5 boys, ages 12 to 14, emerged from a cave opening that Cole could have sworn hadn't been there the day before. They were wearing scout uniforms that were somehow both filthy and pristine, and they moved with the careful alertness of people who had seen too much and understood too little. Help us, the oldest boy said as Cole approached. Our names are Marcus Williams, Kevin Hartley, Danny Rodriguez, Jake Morrison, Billy Foster, and Alex Kumar. We're from Boy Scout Troop 247. We've been missing for 8 days and we need to report a crime. Cole radioed for immediate backup and medical support, then sat the boys down to take their initial statements. What they told her challenged everything she thought she knew about missing persons cases. According to the boys, they had been held in an underground facility by their Scoutmaster, Robert Morrison, who had been conducting some kind of psychological experiment on them. They described chambers that existed beneath the forest floor, conversion processes that altered human consciousness, and merit badges for skills that no legitimate scouting organization had ever sanctioned. But most importantly, they insisted that one of their number, Tommy Chen, had sacrificed himself to ensure their escape and was still trapped in the underground complex. We have to go back for him, Marcus Williams told Detective Sarah Walsh when she arrived on scene. Tommy saved all of us. We can't leave him down there. Walsh studied the 5 boys carefully. They showed signs of malnutrition and psychological stress, but their stories were remarkably consistent and detailed. More importantly, they provided information about Robert Morrison's activities that corroborated evidence her investigation had already uncovered. But when rescue teams attempted to re-enter the cave system the boys had emerged from, they found only ordinary limestone formations. Ground-penetrating radar detected no evidence of the elaborate underground chambers the boys described. The cave system seemed to extend only a few hundred feet into the hillside before terminating in walls of solid rock. For 3 weeks, search teams combed every cave system in Pine Ridge National Forest, looking for any trace of Tommy Chen or the underground facility his friends described. They found nothing that matched the boys' descriptions, but they did make several discoveries that supported their claims. In a cave system nearly 5 miles from where the boys had emerged, investigators found a cache of Boy Scout merit badges dating back to the 1950s. The badges bore names and dates corresponding to missing children cases from across the region, children who had vanished during camping trips or scout outings and never been found. More disturbing was the discovery of Robert Morrison's body in a limestone chamber so deep that it required specialized equipment to reach. Morrison had been dead for several months, but the condition of his remains suggested that he had undergone some kind of surgical modification before his death. His limbs had been elongated, additional joints had been inserted into his arms and legs, and his skull showed evidence of having been opened and resealed multiple times. But perhaps most significant was what investigators found clutched in Morrison's hand, a merit badge unlike any in official scouting literature. The badge was made of materials that didn't match any known earthly substances, and its design seemed to shift and change when observed directly. Engraved on its surface were two words in perfect English: Guardian Merit Badge. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the forensic anthropologist who examined Morrison's remains, submitted a report that was immediately classified by federal authorities. Subject appears to have been used as a host organism for an intelligence of unknown origin. Modifications to skeletal and nervous systems suggest an attempt to create a hybrid entity capable of operating in both human society and environments that exist outside normal spacetime parameters. Cause of death appears to be system rejection. The host organism was unable to maintain stability as biological and non-biological components attempted integration. In chambers that existed in the spaces between normal reality, Tommy Chen sat at a circular table with 6 empty chairs. The Scoutmaster had been forced to retreat to deeper levels of existence when its immediate control over the surface world was broken, but it hadn't been destroyed. It waited with the patience of something that experienced time differently than humans, knowing that sooner or later, Tommy's individual will would weaken enough for the final conversion to proceed. But Tommy had advantages that previous trapped scouts hadn't possessed. His training with Timothy Walsh had taught him techniques for maintaining individual consciousness under extreme psychological pressure. More importantly, he had earned his merit badges through genuine achievement rather than supernatural conditioning, and that gave him a kind of spiritual armor that the Scoutmaster couldn't easily penetrate. "You cannot maintain this resistance indefinitely," the entity said, its voice now coming from everywhere and nowhere. "Your friends have abandoned you. Your family believes you are dead. Accept conversion and join the Eternal Patrol." But Tommy had discovered something that even Timothy Walsh hadn't fully understood. The Scoutmaster's power came from isolation and despair, but it was also dependent on the willing participation of its subjects. As long as Tommy maintained his individual will and his commitment to the values he had learned in legitimate scouting, he could serve as a kind of circuit breaker in the entity's power structure. "I'm not alone," Tommy said clearly, his voice echoing in the impossible chamber. "I'm connected to every scout who has ever earned a merit badge through honest effort, who has ever helped another person without expecting reward, who has ever chosen to do the right thing even when it was difficult. You can't convert that because you can't understand it." The Scoutmaster's response was a sound that existed beyond the normal range of human hearing, an expression of frustration and growing fear as it realized that Tommy Chen might be the first scout it couldn't successfully process. Jake Sullivan had been exploring the limestone caves of Pine Ridge National Forest for over a decade when his ground-penetrating radar detected the anomaly. Deep beneath the forest floor, in a location that corresponded roughly to the area where the 5 scouts had emerged in 1979, his equipment registered a large void that didn't match any known geological formations. It took Sullivan and his team 3 days to locate the actual entrance to the underground chamber. When they finally broke through, they found something that shouldn't have been possible: a perfectly preserved scout meeting room, complete with a circular table, 7 chairs, and walls covered with merit badges spanning decades of scouting history. At the center of the table sat a single figure, a boy who appeared to be about 12 years old, wearing a scout uniform that looked like it had been pressed that morning. Despite 46 years underground, he showed no signs of aging or physical deterioration. "Are you Tommy Chen?" Sullivan asked carefully, his voice echoing in the chamber. The boy looked up with eyes that held depths no 12-year-old should possess. "Yes," he said simply. "Are you here to help me earn my final merit badge?" Tommy's emergence from the underground chamber 46 years after his disappearance made international headlines, but the full story never became public knowledge. Federal authorities classified most of the details, officially describing Tommy's survival as the result of an underground shelter with an unusually stable microclimate. But those who had worked on the original investigation knew better. Tommy Chen had spent 46 years serving as a living seal on something that existed beyond normal human understanding, maintaining his individual will and moral purpose as a barrier between the Scoutmaster and the world above. The other 5 members of Troop 247 had gone on to lead successful lives. Marcus Williams became a teacher, dedicated to helping young people develop critical thinking skills. Kevin Hartley joined the FBI and specialized in cases involving missing children. Danny Rodriguez became a priest, serving communities where people needed someone who understood that evil was real but not invincible. Jake Morrison became a wilderness guide, helping people navigate not just physical terrain but the psychological challenges of surviving in hostile environments. Billy Foster used his family's wealth to establish foundations that supported search and rescue operations. Alex Kumar became a child psychologist, working with young people who had experienced trauma. But they never forgot their promise to return for Tommy Chen. And when news of his discovery reached them, all 5 men dropped everything and traveled back to Pine Ridge National Forest to keep their word. The reunion took place in a conference room at Pine Ridge Ranger Station, with FBI agents and federal officials observing from behind one-way glass. Tommy, who physically remained 12 years old despite decades of chronological time, sat across from 5 middle-aged men who had once been his fellow scouts. "You came back," Tommy said, and his voice carried the same calm certainty it had possessed when he chose to sacrifice himself for their freedom. Marcus Williams, now 58 and showing the gray hair that came with a lifetime of teaching difficult students, nodded slowly. "We promised we would." "How long has it been?" Tommy asked. 46 years, Kevin Hartley replied. He was now a senior FBI agent, and his analytical skills had been sharpened by decades of investigating cases that most people couldn't imagine. "We never stopped looking for you." Tommy smiled, and for a moment he looked exactly like the 12-year-old boy who had walked into darkness to save his friends. "I've been busy," he said, "earning merit badges you wouldn't believe." Danny Rodriguez, now Father Rodriguez of St. Margaret's Parish, leaned forward. Are you still yourself?" "More myself than I've ever been," Tommy replied. "When you spend 46 years defending your individual will against something that wants to erase it, you learn exactly who you are and what you stand for." Jake Morrison, scarred by decades of wilderness work and the knowledge of what his father had become, asked the question they were all thinking. "Is it over? Is the thing that took us finally gone?" Tommy considered the question carefully. "The Scoutmaster still exists, but it can't operate in our reality anymore. I disrupted its connection to the surface world. But there are other entities like it, operating in other places using different methods. The work isn't finished." Billy Foster, whose foundation had funded search and rescue operations across 3 states, understood what Tommy was suggesting. "You want to continue?" "I want to help," Tommy clarified. "I've learned things over the past 46 years that could protect other children from what happened to us. I've earned merit badges that don't exist in any manual: Guardian Merit Badge, Resistance Merit Badge, Disruption Merit Badge. I want to teach those skills to people who might need them." Alex Kumar, who had spent his career helping traumatized children, recognized something in Tommy's demeanor that transcended age or experience. "You're not just talking about fighting monsters," he said. "You're talking about creating an entirely new kind of scout program." Tommy nodded. "Scouts who are prepared for threats that don't appear in any handbook. Scouts who know that the most important merit badge isn't the one you earn, but the one you help someone else achieve. Scouts who understand that sometimes the greatest service you can perform is standing guard in the darkness so others can sleep peacefully in the light." 6 months after Tommy Chen's return to the surface world, a new program quietly launched within certain elite units of the FBI, the National Park Service, and specialized search and rescue organizations. Officially, it was called the Wilderness Threat Assessment and Response Protocol. Unofficially, participants referred to it as Deep Scouting. The program's founder and primary instructor was a boy who appeared to be 12 years old but spoke with the authority of someone who had spent decades learning to defend human consciousness against forces that operated beyond normal understanding. Tommy Chen's curriculum included traditional wilderness survival skills, but also more esoteric abilities: how to recognize when reality was being artificially manipulated, techniques for maintaining individual will under extreme psychological pressure, and methods for identifying and disrupting supernatural threats to human welfare. The 5 original members of Troop 247 served as the program's advisory board, bringing their decades of professional experience to support Tommy's unprecedented expertise. They also served as living proof that it was possible to survive encounters with entities like the Scoutmaster and emerge stronger rather than broken. But perhaps most importantly, they provided Tommy with something he had been denied during his 46 years underground: a family of people who understood what he had sacrificed and why it had been necessary. Tommy Chen never physically aged beyond 12 years old, a side effect of spending decades in an environment where time operated differently than in normal reality. But he had gained something that no amount of conventional education could provide: absolute certainty about the difference between right and wrong, between service and selfishness, between courage and recklessness. He established his headquarters in a renovated cabin near Pine Ridge National Forest, close enough to the sealed cave entrance to monitor it for any signs of renewed supernatural activity. The cabin served as both home and training center for the small group of individuals who proved capable of learning deep scouting techniques. Every year on October 13th, Tommy returned to the memorial that had been erected at the site where his friends had emerged from the underground chambers. The memorial bore 7 names, honoring all the members of Troop 247, but Tommy's name was engraved differently than the others. Instead of birth and death dates, his entry simply read, "Tommy Chen, Guardian, still on duty." The memorial received visitors throughout the year: families of missing children, search and rescue personnel, and occasionally, people who had encountered things in the wilderness that couldn't be explained by conventional understanding. Tommy made it a point to speak with these visitors when possible, offering guidance to those who seemed ready to learn and comfort to those who simply needed to know that someone understood their experiences. But the most important visitors were the ones who came looking for training. Young men and women who had heard rumors about the deep scouting program, who had encountered unexplained phenomena in their work with law enforcement or park services, or who had simply developed an intuitive understanding that the world contained threats that conventional methods couldn't address. To these individuals, Tommy offered the same choice he had made as a 12-year-old boy: the opportunity to stand guard in the darkness, to learn skills that most people would never need, and to accept the responsibility that came with knowledge of what really existed in the spaces between normal reality. Most declined. The training was difficult, the risks were real, and the work was often thankless. But a few accepted, and those few formed the core of an organization that would never be officially recognized but would quietly protect countless lives from threats that most people would never know existed. What Tommy experienced during his 46 years underground defied every law of physics and psychology. The Scoutmaster had trapped him in a temporal loop where days repeated but consciousness remained linear. Each loop, Tommy had to choose again whether to accept conversion or maintain his resistance. Each day he fought the same battle for his individual will. The entity would show him visions of his friends living normal lives above ground, growing up, getting married, having children, all while he remained frozen as a 12-year-old boy in an underground chamber. It offered him release, aging, a normal life, if he would simply accept the Great Merit Badge and join the collective consciousness. But Tommy had learned the entity's greatest weakness: it couldn't comprehend genuine self-sacrifice. Every time the Scoutmaster tried to convert him by offering rewards, Tommy's commitment to protecting others became stronger. The entity was trapped in a cycle of trying to break someone who became more unbreakable with each attempt. During the long years, Tommy wasn't entirely alone. Timothy Walsh visited him in the spaces between loops, teaching him advanced techniques for maintaining sanity under impossible conditions. Other converted scouts from previous decades would sometimes break through the collective programming long enough to offer encouragement or share information about the entity's vulnerabilities. Most importantly, Tommy discovered that his presence in the deep chambers was slowly poisoning the Scoutmaster's ability to process new victims. 3 other scout groups had been lured to Pine Ridge during the intervening decades, but the entity's conversion attempts had failed. The boys had either escaped entirely or been found by rescue teams before the processing could begin. Tommy's resistance was creating a kind of spiritual interference that disrupted the entity's core functions. In 2023, Tommy finally learned the Scoutmaster's complete origin story from a converted scout named Robert Kim who had been trapped since 1967. Kim had maintained enough individual awareness to piece together the entity's history over decades of observation. The Scoutmaster had once been human, a group of 7 Boy Scouts who had participated in an experimental merit badge program in 1847. The program had been designed by a rogue educator named Elias Granger who believed that human potential could be unlocked through exposure to cosmic consciousness. Instead, the 7 boys had been consumed by something ancient that lived in the limestone caves beneath what would later become Pine Ridge Forest. Their individual consciousnesses had been merged into a collective entity that retained their human memories and scouting knowledge but served purposes that were utterly alien to human experience. For over 150 years, the Scoutmaster had been trying to complete its original merit badge requirements on a cosmic scale. It needed to process exactly 77 scout groups, 7 scouts each across 11 generations, to earn what it called the Universe Merit Badge and transcend its earthly limitations. By 1979, it had successfully processed 67 groups. Troop 247 was intended to be the 68th. Tommy's resistance had not only prevented his own group's conversion but had disrupted the entity's progress so severely that it could no longer maintain the energy required for the final phase of its plan. On October 13, 2025, exactly 46 years after the original disappearance, Chen made a decision that would end the Scoutmaster's threat permanently. He had spent decades learning the entity's weaknesses, and he finally understood how to exploit them. The Scoutmaster needed willing participants to maintain its existence. Every converted scout had to choose, at some level, to accept the collective consciousness over individual identity. But Tommy had discovered that the choice could be reversed, not just for individuals but for the entire collective. Using techniques taught to him by Timothy Walsh and refined through decades of resistance, Tommy opened his consciousness to the full collective experience of every scout the entity had ever converted. Instead of being overwhelmed by the flood of alien thought patterns, Tommy used his training to introduce a new element into the collective, the memory of genuine scouting experiences. He flooded the Scoutmaster's consciousness with memories of real campfires where boys learned to work together without losing their individuality. He shared recollections of merit badge ceremonies where achievement was celebrated rather than exploited. Most powerfully, he transmitted the emotional experience of choosing to sacrifice oneself for others, not as an act of submission, but as an expression of ultimate personal freedom. The effect on the collective consciousness was catastrophic. Converted scouts from across more than a century of captures began to remember who they had been before their transformation. Individual personalities reasserted themselves against the collective programming. The Scoutmaster's unified voice dissolved into dozens of separate voices as its converted subjects reclaimed their individual identities. But the entity made one final attempt to maintain control. It offered Tommy the ultimate bargain. It would release every converted scout, restore their individual consciousness and return them to their families, but only if Tommy would accept permanent conversion and serve as the collective's new central consciousness. Tommy's response was immediate and absolute. A scout helps other people at all times. He accepted the entity's offer, knowing that his individual consciousness would be subsumed into something larger, but also knowing that his sacrifice would free dozens of victims and prevent future captures. When Jake Sullivan's team finally broke into the deepest chamber of the cave system, they found something unprecedented. Dozens of people, ranging in age from 12 to elderly, all wearing scout uniforms from different eras, all conscious and individual, all free. Chen stood at the center of the group, still 12 years old but somehow radiating an authority that transcended physical age. In his hands was a merit badge unlike any other, a simple patch that seemed to be made of crystallized starlight, bearing only 2 words, "Mission complete." "The Scoutmaster is gone," Tommy told the rescue team. It couldn't survive the introduction of genuine human values into its collective consciousness. Every scout it ever converted chose individual freedom when given the real option. Timothy Walsh, now appearing his actual age for the first time since 1961, stepped forward with tears streaming down his face. "We're free," he said simply. "All of us. For the first time in over a century, we're free." Pine Ridge National Forest was redesignated as a memorial preserve in 2026. The cave system where the Scoutmaster had operated was sealed permanently, but not before a proper ceremony was conducted to honor every scout who had been lost to the entity over the decades. Chen, finally allowed to age normally, chose to remain in the area as the memorial's chief ranger. His physical appearance gradually caught up with his chronological age, but he retained the deep wisdom and unshakable moral compass that had been forged during his years of resistance. The 5 other members of Troop 247 visited regularly, bringing their children and grandchildren to learn about courage, sacrifice, and the importance of standing up to forces that sought to erase individual human dignity. The memorial became a training ground for a new generation of what Tommy called reality scouts. Young people trained to recognize and resist attempts at psychological manipulation, whether supernatural or mundane. On quiet October evenings, visitors to the memorial often reported hearing the sound of children singing around a campfire that cast no light. The songs were traditional scout melodies, but the voices carried a harmony that spoke of lessons learned in darkness and victories earned through sacrifice. Tommy Chen had earned his final merit badge, the knowledge that some things are worth protecting regardless of personal cost, and that courage isn't the absence of fear but the decision to act rightly in spite of fear. The patch on his uniform simply read, "Guardian Mission Ongoing." Because the work is never really finished. There are always more children who need protection, more darkness that needs to be held at bay, and more scouts ready to learn that the most important merit badge is the one you earn by helping others earn theirs. The story of the 7 Boy Scouts who vanished in 1979 is complete, but the legacy of their courage continues. Subscribe to Lost Mystery Stories for more tales of ordinary people who chose to do extraordinary things, because some mysteries are solved not by finding answers, but by choosing to become the answer others need.